My name is Renata Voss. I am 31 years old. The morning my grandmother's estate attorney called me into his office to sign the documents transferring her entire bakery business to my cousin Marcus, I found out that my grandmother had been alive for the past 8 months, and that my own mother had told me she was dead. I sat in that leather chair across from a man named Gerald Pratt who wore a brown tie and wire-rimmed glasses, and the whole room tilted sideways when he said it. He had a file folder open on his desk with my grandmother's signature right there on top, dated 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks ago. I had attended a funeral. I had carried flowers. I had stood at a graveside in October rain and sobbed until my ribs ached. And now here was Gerald Pratt sliding a document across a mahogany desk asking me to sign away her life's work, and I could not even speak because the file in front of him had her name on it in present tense. Not a state of. Not in memory of. Just, Helga Voss, proprietor. My mother had buried a woman who was still baking bread. I know how that sounds. I know it sounds impossible. I spent the first 20 minutes of that meeting thinking I had misread something, that I was confused, that grief had made me slow. But Gerald Pratt was not confused. Gerald Pratt was very calm in the particular way that lawyers are calm when they are hoping you will sign something before you understand it. He said my grandmother had executed a new business trust 4 months prior, naming my cousin Marcus as sole operating heir to Voss Bread and Provisions, the bakery she had built in Asheville, North Carolina over 42 years. He said I was listed as a secondary beneficiary for a symbolic 5% interest, which amounted to approximately $11,000. He pushed a second sheet across the desk. He said if I signed today, the transition would be seamless and the family could move forward. He used the word seamless twice. I noticed that. I also noticed that he never once said my grandmother was dead. I finally said it out loud. I said, "Gerald, is my grandmother alive?" And he took off his wire-rimmed glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose and said, "Ms. Voss, your grandmother signed these documents herself on March the 14th. I did not sign anything that day." I stood up and walked out of Gerald Pratt's office on a Tuesday morning in April and sat in my car in a parking garage in downtown Asheville for 40 minutes trying to figure out what my mother had done and why. Let me go back. Because nothing about that morning made sense without the years that came before it, and there were a lot of years. My grandmother's name was Helga Voss, and she was the kind of woman who made every room smell like yeast and brown sugar just by walking into it. She had come to Asheville from Stuttgart in 1979 with her husband Dieter and $40 and 2 suitcases and a recipe book she had carried in her coat pocket on the plane. Dieter died in 1993 of a heart attack behind the counter of the original shop on Lexington Avenue. Helga kept it open the next morning. She opened it because she said Dieter would have laughed at her if she didn't, and she was right. That bakery had been her whole life for longer than I had been alive. Growing up, I spent every summer and most school breaks on Lexington Avenue. I knew how to shape a boule at age 7. I knew the names of the suppliers, the regulars, the way the second oven ran hot on the left side. My grandmother taught me everything she knew not because she sat me down and said here is a lesson, but because she let me stand beside her and watch and ask questions and she always answered. That is how she taught. She answered everything. She never made me feel small for not knowing. My mother, Claudette, was Helga's only child. And my mother had a complicated relationship with the bakery, which is the polite version of saying she resented it with a quiet fury that had never fully cooled. Claudette had not wanted to be a baker's daughter. She had wanted to be something she considered more significant, though she changed what that was depending on who she was talking to. When I was growing up, she told people she had given up a career in interior design to raise me and my brother Tobias. Tobias is 4 years older than me, steady and quiet, works in logistics in Charlotte, and mostly stays out of family business. My mother told other people she had sacrificed a real estate opportunity. She told my father, Leonard, who was a high school geography teacher with a patient disposition, that she had given up more than he would ever understand. My father absorbed this the way he absorbed most things, quietly, and went back to grading maps. What my mother never said out loud but communicated in 1,000 other ways was that she believed Helga's bakery should have funded a different kind of life for the Voss family, and that it had instead simply made Helga modestly comfortable and occasionally famous in the local food press, and that this was a personal failure directed at Claudette specifically. Marcus was my Uncle Remy's son. Remy was Helga's nephew, not even her direct child, just a nephew she had always liked because he was charming and showed up for holidays and had the kind of easy laugh that made people feel good about themselves. Marcus had grown up in Greenville, South Carolina, had done 2 years of culinary school, dropped out, worked at a catering company, done some bar consulting, and somewhere along the way had started calling himself a hospitality entrepreneur. He was 34 and had no particular baking experience that I had ever witnessed, but he had been coming to Asheville more and more frequently over the past 2 years, and now I was learning that during those visits he had apparently been convincing my grandmother to restructure a trust she had built around 42 years of her own work. I did not know then how deep the roots of that went. I would find out. After I left the parking garage, I drove to Tobias. Not home, not my apartment on the other side of town where I had been living for 6 years and running a small food photography business out of the spare room. I drove straight to my brother because Tobias was the only person in the family I trusted to tell me the truth and also the only one I trusted to stay calm while doing it. He was on his lunch break when I got there, standing in his kitchen making a sandwich, and I sat down at his table and told him everything. I told him about Gerald Pratt and the document and the signature dated March the 14th. Tobias set down his sandwich. He sat across from me. He said, "Renata, I went to the funeral. I saw the casket." I said, "I know. I was there too." He said, "What kind of casket has a living person in it?" And that was when I said the thing I had been trying not to say since I left the parking garage. I said, "Tobias, what if there was nobody in it?" I want to be careful here because I know how this sounds. I know it sounds like a bad movie. But the funeral in October had been a closed casket, which my mother had explained by saying Helga had requested it for reasons of privacy and dignity, and none of us had questioned that because Helga was a private woman about some things, particularly about her body and what happened to it. The service had been at the Lutheran Church on Marymount Avenue, well attended, flowers everywhere. The organist played 2 of the hymns Helga had loved, and my mother stood at the front looking appropriately bereaved in a gray wool coat, and I had cried the entire time, and Marcus had sat in the 3rd row with his father Remy looking serious and supportive, and nobody had said a word that gave any of it away. Not one word. I had gone home afterward and spent 3 days in bed with grief and a cold that arrived at exactly the wrong time, and my mother had called me twice a day to check on me, and each time her voice had been exactly calibrated to the appropriate frequency of a woman who had just lost her mother. She had been performing it. She had been performing it for 5 months before I walked into Gerald Pratt's office, and the performance collapsed. Tobias and I sat at his kitchen table for an hour. We did not eat. We went through everything we could remember. The hospice timeline my mother had described in September, the rapid decline she had narrated over the phone, the fact that neither Tobias nor I had been invited to Helga's bedside at the end because my mother said it had been very fast and Helga had slipped into unconsciousness before there was time. I remembered now that I had asked to visit in September and my mother had said Helga was too fragile for visitors and was resting, and I had said okay because I did not want to cause stress, and my mother had known I would say that. She had known exactly what I would and would not push back on. She had built the entire fiction around the places where I trusted her. That was the part that kept arriving like a fist. Not that she had lied. That she had known exactly where the lies would hold. I called my grandmother's house that afternoon from the parking lot of Tobias's apartment complex. I had not called it since October because you do not call a dead woman's house. The number was still in my phone from years of Sunday calls. It rang 4 times. Then it picked up. There was silence for a second, just breathing and the faint sound of something in the background, a radio maybe, and then a voice I had not heard in 5 months said, "Wer da? Who is there?" In German, the way she always answered when she was startled or uncertain. I could not speak. I said, "Oma." And she said, "Renata?" And then she started crying. Not soft crying. Hard crying, the kind that comes from somewhere deep and held, and I sat in that parking lot and cried with her for 10 minutes before either of us could form a complete sentence. What she told me over the next hour broke something open that I don't have a perfect word for. She had been told in late August, by my mother, that I had decided to step away from the family, that I had made statements about not wanting any involvement with the bakery or the estate, that I had essentially communicated my withdrawal from any inheritance expectation. She had been told this by Claudette during a visit to the house, during one of the weeks when Helga had been unwell with a respiratory infection that had left her tired and confused and not at her best for reasoning through complex things. My mother had brought paperwork. She had brought Gerald Pratt. She had told Helga that I had already been consulted and had agreed, and Helga, ill and trusting her only daughter and not having heard otherwise from me because I had been calling and getting no answer and assuming she was resting, had signed documents she did not fully understand. Then in October my mother had told Helga that there was going to be a small memorial service to celebrate her life while she was still living, a kind of living funeral some families do. And Helga had agreed to that because she thought it was a touching idea and because she was still recovering and did not attend and therefore never knew it was presented to the rest of us as her actual death. My mother had simply told the family she was gone and held a service and kept Helga isolated in her house on the other side of town for 5 months, managing her care through a private aide, intercepting her calls, and waiting for the estate documents to finalize so that by the time anyone found out, it would all be a done deal and too late to unwind. It was the most elaborate and cold-blooded thing I had ever heard, and it had been done by a woman who called me twice a week and asked how I was eating. I drove to my grandmother's house that same evening. It was a yellow house on Kimberly Avenue with a fig tree in the front yard and wind chimes Helga had made herself from old spoons. I had not been there since September. The fig tree had new leaves. The wind chimes were moving. I knocked on the door and the aide, a soft-spoken woman named Dorothea, opened it and looked at me with an expression that said she had been expecting someone to eventually show up. My grandmother was in the kitchen. She had been baking. The whole house smelled like the cardamom rolls she had made every Saturday of my childhood, and she was standing at the counter with flour on her hands, and she was 81 years old and completely alive. I stood in the doorway and could not move. She turned around. She opened her arms. I crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and held her, and neither of us spoke for a long time because there was nothing that words were going to add to that moment. We just stood there in the smell of cardamom and warm dough, and the wind chimes moved outside and the fig tree was putting out new leaves and my grandmother was alive. Over the next 3 days I learned the full shape of it. Tobias drove down from Charlotte. We sat with Helga at the kitchen table, all 3 of us, and we listened and we took notes. Dorothea had been hired by my mother but had not been told the funeral fabrication part of it. She had simply been told that Helga was recovering from illness and needed support and that the family was managing a complicated situation. Dorothea was kind and professional and had noticed things she hadn't known what to do with. She told us that Marcus had visited the house 4 times between September and January, usually with a notebook, always staying for 2 to 3 hours, always leaving with my grandmother looking tired. She told us that a woman she did not recognize had come once in February and brought a large bouquet of flowers and spent 40 minutes with Helga alone in the sitting room, and that after the woman left Helga had been quiet for the rest of the day. Dorothea described the woman's coat. Gray wool. Mid-length. I knew the coat. I had a photograph of my mother wearing it at the funeral. What I needed now was evidence. Not just Helga's account, which was powerful but which could be challenged on the basis of her age and her illness during the signing period. I needed the documents themselves, the timeline, the communications, something that showed the sequence of events clearly enough that no attorney could reframe it. Tobias called a woman he knew from college who had become an estate litigation attorney in Charlotte. Her name was Patricia Chen, and she agreed to take a call the next morning. She listened to everything and then said, "If what you're describing is accurate, this is a combination of undue influence, elder financial abuse, and fraudulent misrepresentation, and in North Carolina those are serious matters, both civilly and potentially criminally." She said we needed 3 things. The original documents Helga had signed and any communications surrounding them. Evidence that Helga's capacity had been compromised at the time of signing. And evidence that my mother had made material misrepresentations, specifically the claim that I had agreed to step back. That last one, Patricia said, was the hinge. If Helga had signed because she was told I had consented, and I had not consented, and that misrepresentation could be proven, the entire trust amendment was voidable. She said to get Helga's medical records from the period of the signing. She said to get anything in writing. She said to be careful about tipping off my mother before we had the documentation in order. I did not call my mother. I let 4 days pass. I went to the bakery instead. Voss Bread and Provisions was still operating, managed by the longtime head baker, a woman named Suzanne who had worked for Helga for 19 years and who hugged me hard when I walked through the door and then held me at arm's length and said, "Renata, what is happening?" I told her what I knew. Suzanne sat down on a flour sack and looked at the ceiling for a long time. She said, "Your cousin Marcus came in here in January and told me he would be taking over in the summer. He told me Helga had passed and that he was the new owner and that I should expect a transition plan by spring." I said, "Suzanne, my grandmother is alive. She lives on Kimberly Avenue. She made cardamom rolls 3 days ago." Suzanne's face did a complicated thing. Then she stood up and went back to the bread. The medical records took 9 days to obtain. Helga's primary physician was a Dr. Arvo Lund, a mild-mannered internist who had been treating her for 11 years. When I explained the situation to Dr. Lund's office manager, she was quiet for a moment and then said she would need to speak to the doctor before releasing anything, but that she could tell me one thing, which was that there had been concerns documented in the September visit about the suitability of making major legal decisions during a period of acute respiratory illness accompanied by some cognitive fogginess. Dr. Lund had made a note. He had not been consulted before the documents were signed. Patricia Chen said that note was gold. While the records were coming in, Tobias found something on his own that none of us had been looking for. He had been going through old emails, the family group thread that had been active for years, and he noticed that in late July, 3 months before the fake funeral, my mother had sent a private email to Marcus, not to the group thread but directly to Marcus, that had been accidentally CC'd to Tobias because she had typed the first 3 letters of his name and the autocomplete had grabbed him along with Marcus. Tobias had never opened the email in July because the subject line was just the word logistics and he had assumed it was something about Remy's family visit scheduling. He had opened it now. It was 4 paragraphs long. In the second paragraph, my mother wrote, "Marcus, the key problem is Renata. She has always been Helga's favorite and Helga will not restructure anything if she thinks Renata objects. We need Renata out of the picture before we approach the attorney. I will manage the family communication side. You focus on the relationship with Helga. Make yourself useful at the bakery. Be present. We need her to trust you. The rest will follow." It was dated July 29th. That was 8 months before I sat in Gerald Prett's office. My mother had been planning this for 8 months before I found out. Patricia Chen said the email was potentially the most important document in the case because it showed premeditation and it named both parties. She said we needed to be strategic about when we used it. She filed a formal petition to contest the trust amendment in Buncombe County Probate Court on the grounds of undue influence and elder financial abuse. She notified Gerald Prett's office the same day. She requested an emergency order to freeze the business transfer pending the outcome of the contested proceeding. The judge granted the freeze within 48 hours. The transfer to Marcus did not go through. The day the freeze was granted, my mother called me. I let it ring. She called Tobias. He let it ring. She called the bakery and Suzanne picked up and said she was not the right person to speak to about legal matters and gave her Patricia Chen's number. My mother did not call Patricia Chen. Instead, 3 days later, Marcus called me directly. He used a number I didn't recognize, and I picked up because I thought it might be Dr. Lund's office. Marcus's voice was very controlled in the way voices get when someone has rehearsed what they're going to say. He said, "Renata, I think we all got off on the wrong foot. I think if we sat down we could work something out that was fair to everyone." He said fair to everyone with a particular emphasis that suggested fair to everyone meant fair to Marcus. I said, "Marcus, I'm going to stop you. I'm not having this conversation without my attorney present." He paused. He said, "I think you're making this harder than it needs to be." I said, "My grandmother is 81 years old. She had flour on her hands when I got there. She's been baking in a house on Kimberly Avenue for 5 months while we thought she was dead. There is no version of this that I am making harder than it needs to be." I ended the call. I saved the recording because my phone records all calls automatically, a habit I had picked up after a contractor dispute 2 years earlier and never disabled. Helga, through all of this, was extraordinary. I want to say that clearly because it would be easy to describe her only as a victim in this story, and she was not. She was angry, and she was specific about her anger, and she directed it with the precision of a woman who had been building things with her hands for 60 years. She called Gerald Pratt herself, on a Thursday morning in May, and told him that she wanted a record in his file that she had signed documents under conditions of material misrepresentation and that she had never at any point been informed by anyone that her granddaughter Renata had expressed any intention of withdrawing from the family or the estate. She said this in a voice that had no tremor in it. Gerald Pratt was very quiet on his end of the call. She told me about it afterward over coffee at her kitchen table. She said, "He sounded very small." I told her that was probably accurate. The probate proceeding moved in what Patricia Chen called unusually brisk time for an estate matter, which she attributed to the quality of the documentation and the fact that an 81-year-old woman was sitting in the courthouse for every hearing in a cardigan she had knitted herself, watching the proceedings with calm and complete attention. The email from July was entered into evidence in the third hearing. My mother's attorney, a man named Fowler who wore expensive shoes and kept straightening his tie, tried to argue that the email was a private communication taken out of context and did not constitute a plan of action. Patricia Chen asked him to define what context would make the phrase "we need Renata out of the picture" mean something other than what it said. Fowler straightened his tie. My mother, who was sitting at the respondent's table, did not look at me once during that hearing. Not once. She kept her eyes on a point slightly to the left of the judge's shoulder, and her face was entirely composed in the way that I now understood meant she was managing a performance rather than feeling anything. Marcus's attorney tried a different approach. He argued that Marcus had acted in good faith based on representations made by Claudette Voss, and that any misrepresentation to Helga was Claudette's responsibility alone, and that Marcus had simply accepted an offer made to him in what appeared to be a legitimate business transfer. Patricia Chen said that was a creative argument and that she looked forward to the court examining the text messages between Marcus and Claudette from August through January, which she had obtained via discovery and which included Marcus writing to my mother, "I'll take her to the house again this week and soften her up about the East location expansion idea." Patricia also had Marcus's calendar, which Remy had provided because Remy, to his credit, had been horrified when he found out and had cooperated fully. The calendar showed 8 visits to Helga's house between September and January. Marcus's argument that he had acted in good faith required ignoring 8 months of choreographed presence. There was a moment in the 4th hearing that I keep coming back to. It was a Wednesday morning, and my mother was on the stand, and Patricia Chin was asking her about the October service, the event she had presented to the family as a funeral. My mother said that it had been a celebration of life intended to honor Helga while she was still living, but that there had been a miscommunication about how it was framed to family members. Patricia Chin said, "Mrs. Voss, at the service, did you tell your children that your mother had died?" My mother said, "I told them she had passed." Patricia said, "And passed meaning what, in that context?" My mother said, "People use that word in different ways." Patricia said, "Did you purchase a casket?" My mother said yes. Patricia said, "Was there anyone in the casket?" My mother said the casket was symbolic. Patricia said, "Your daughter Renata spent 3 days in bed after the service due to grief and illness. Did you call her during that period?" My mother said yes. Patricia said, "Did you at any point during those calls tell her that her grandmother was alive?" My mother said nothing for 11 seconds. I counted. Then she said, "I was managing a very complicated situation." Patricia turned to the judge and said she had no further questions. The ruling came 4 weeks later. The trust amendment was voided in its entirety. The court found clear and convincing evidence of undue influence exerted upon Helga Voss during a period of documented diminished capacity and found that the amendment had been procured through material misrepresentations, including the false claim that Renata Voss had consented to step back from the estate. The original trust, written by Helga in 2019, was reinstated. Under the original trust, the bakery and all its assets passed to Helga's direct descendants equally, meaning Tobias and me, with Helga retaining full operational authority during her lifetime. The ruling also referred the matter to the Buncombe County District Attorney's Office for review of potential elder financial abuse charges. Marcus's involvement was referred separately for review. Gerald Pratt received a formal inquiry from the North Carolina State Bar. My mother did not face criminal charges in the end. The DA's office determined that the case, while deeply troubling, presented complications in proving criminal intent beyond a reasonable doubt given the civil ruling already obtained. Patricia Chin said that was not unusual. She said sometimes the civil system delivers justice faster than the criminal one and that the civil ruling itself was significant. Helga said she was not interested in watching her daughter go to prison. She said she was interested in her daughter understanding what she had done. She was not sure she would ever get that. But she was clear about what she wanted. My mother called me the day after the ruling. Her voice had a quality I had not heard before, flatter than usual, stripped of its performance layer. She said, "Renata, I want you to know that I thought I was doing what was best for the family. I thought Marcus had the vision and the energy to take the bakery somewhere new. I thought you didn't want it." I said, "Mom, I have spent every summer of my life in that bakery. I learned to shape bread at 7 years old. I have 4,000 photographs of those counters on my hard drive. You knew exactly what I wanted. You knew it was in my way." She was quiet. I said, "You told your mother I was dead to her. Not with those words, but that's what you told her. You took 5 months of her life and you made her spend them thinking her granddaughter had walked away. She's 81. Do you understand what 5 months means at 81? My mother said, "I know what I did." I said, "I'm not sure you do." And then I said the thing I had been deciding whether to say since April. I said, "I need time, Mom. I need a lot of time. And I'm not going to tell you how much or what the end of it looks like. You don't get a timeline from me." She said okay. She said it small. I said goodbye and I meant it for that day at least, maybe for longer, I still don't know. What happened at the bakery over the following months was the part one hadn't planned for and the part that ended up mattering most. Suzanne and I sat down together in early June and I told her what I wanted to do, which was not to swoop in and take over as some triumphant owner but to apprentice myself to the operation properly, to earn the knowledge I didn't have, to learn the things my grandmother had not yet taught me because we had always assumed there would be more time. Suzanne looked at me for a long moment and then said, "Your grandmother said you were always the one who asked the questions." I said, "She taught me to do that." Suzanne said, "Then ask." I started going in at 5 in the morning, 3 days a week, then 4. I learned the sourdough schedule and the wholesale accounts and the supplier relationships and the particular way the second oven ran hot on the left side. I already knew that last part, but I let Suzanne tell me again because some things deserve to be told more than once. My grandmother came in on Saturdays. Not every Saturday, and not for full days, but she came in and she stood at the counter she had stood at for 42 years and she did the things she had always done, and the regulars who came in looked at her the way people look at something they thought they had lost and now understood they had been given back. One Saturday morning in July she was showing me the lamination technique for the Friday pastry, the one she had adapted from something her own mother had taught her in Stuttgart, and she looked up mid-demonstration and said, "I was afraid you would be angry at me for signing." I said, "Oma, I'm not angry at you. I was never angry at you." She said, "I should have called you. I should have made them let me call you." I said, "They didn't give you the right information. None of what happened was because of you." She folded the dough carefully. She said, "Renata, a person only knows the truth they've been given. I was given the wrong truth. I'm sorry it cost you months." I told her the months were over. She said, "Yes." She pressed the fold down clean. She said, "Now we're here." The photograph that ended up mattering most was not one I had taken professionally. It was a phone picture Tobias took on a Saturday in August, in the bakery, of me and Helga standing at the counter with our hands both on the same round of dough. Her hands on the left side, mine on the right. Both of us looking down at the work. Neither of us looking at the camera. Tobias sent it to the family thread, and then someone shared it somewhere, and it found its way to the local food writer at the Asheville Citizen-Times who had covered the bakery twice before. She called and asked if she could write a piece for the fall issue of their food supplement. She called it a story about continuity. She said she wanted to write about what it meant to carry something forward. I said that sounded right to me. Helga is still baking. She is 81 and she came in last Saturday and the cardamom rolls were perfect, the way they have always been perfect, because she has been making them for 60 years and her hands know the recipe in a way that does not require reading it. I have been there 5 mornings a week since June and I can feel the rhythm starting to live in my hands the same way, not fully, not yet, but it is coming. Suzanne says I have my grandmother's instinct for the dough. I think she means I know when to push and when to let it rest. There are probably other lessons in that if I wanted to pull them out, but mostly I just think about bread. Tobias came down in September for a weekend and we all had dinner at Helga's house, the 3 of us, and Helga made sauerbraten and potato dumplings and set the table with the good cloth she only used for people she loved. After dinner she brought out the recipe book she had carried in her coat pocket on the plane from Stuttgart in 1979. She set it on the table between us. She did not say anything dramatic about it. She just set it down and told Tobias and me that she wanted us to know where it was. We sat with it for a while, turning pages carefully, reading her mother's handwriting in the margins next to her own. The fig tree was doing its late September thing outside. The wind chimes moved. Everything was where it was supposed to be. I still have the voicemail my mother left me in April, the day after the freeze order, when she was still trying to get ahead of it. I have not listened to it since I first played it. I have not deleted it either. I'm not sure which of those things says more about where I am. My mother and I have spoken 3 times since the ruling. Short calls. Cautious. She does not ask about the bakery and I do not offer it. Maybe that changes eventually. I don't spend a lot of time calculating the odds because the odds depend on her and she is not someone whose interior life I can accurately predict, as it turns out. What I do know is that there is a version of forward that does not require that particular door to be open. I hope she figures out what she did. I hope it costs her the right amount. I genuinely don't know what the right amount is. That is the most honest thing I can say about it. What I think about most is the phone call in April, the one I made on a Tuesday afternoon from a parking garage in downtown Asheville to a number I had stopped calling because you don't call a dead woman's house. 4 rings. Breathing. A radio in the background. Wersta. And then her voice when she heard mine. That cry. That long-held thing finally letting go. I had been carrying a grief for 5 months that turned out to be a lie, and I had not known it was a lie, and when the truth arrived, it arrived in her voice, and it sounded like cardamom and brown sugar and 42 years of her hands in the dough, and the fig tree was putting out new leaves, and she was 81, and she was alive, and I had not lost her at all. I had just been told I had. That is what my mother took from us. That is also what she could not actually take. The time exists. We are spending it. I have flour under my fingernails most mornings, and I'm learning the way the second oven runs hot on the left side, and my grandmother comes in on Saturdays and stands at the counter she has stood at for 42 years, and the recipe book from Stuttgart is in the glass cabinet above the register where everyone can see it, and none of this is something anyone can undo now. It belongs to us. It always did.